I don't want to eat up your time because you have such a rich portfolio of different articles that you develop for your thesis, and that you also in now your postdoc or beginning postdoc research cultivate. So that I wanted actually to give you as much room as possible, because what you do also links to, I don't know if Marina, yes, Marina can join also to work of Marina on EU science diplomacy. We are very happy to begin the academic year with Zane Sime, who's visiting research fellow at the United Nations University Institute for Comparative Regional Integration Studies. And she has a very strong focus on EU science diplomacy, also highly informed by different forms of bordering elements, dimensions to knowledge, knowledge diplomacy. She wrote a PhD thesis that is, I assume, still under revision, right? Or is that?
I'm waiting for the review and potential defense.
Super. And I only can recommend to take a look. It's 8 very interesting articles around the topic of science, EU science diplomacy, with a country focus on Tunisia and Morocco, that very much informs us about different dimensions of EU science diplomacy, also earth science, so disciplinary topic and a regional focus. On top of your work on science diplomacy, obviously, you also work on more macro regional aspect of EU educational policy also, but also on governance questions. And that's what we will also hear in your presentation, because you look also into the embedment and structural link between science diplomacy and classical diplomacy, so the structural diplomacy, which has a strong governance component, which is very interesting from our point of view. And on top of your research experience with College of Europe and also the OSCE Academy, you also have practical experience, if I'm not wrong, with the Latvian civil service, but also with a lot of EU Commission expert groups on science diplomacy, making EU talk, making it more resilient, more efficient, through science evidence, scientific evidence and foresight, but also in a very interesting working group of the Asia-Europe Summit on science diplomacy. So a lot of institutionalized forums, interstate forums that are asking for input on science diplomacy. And there you are country expert on Norway and Latvia, right, for the interim reports. So you basically combine what we are also researching here, the expertise that is practical, and the research on the expertise, which is very, very interesting for us. So as I already mentioned, we have pre-discussed that in the discussion. We will focus on these interdisciplinary and knowledge forms, but now, first of all, a big goal for you to talk us through the universe of knowledge you created for your PhD thesis, and we're very, very happy to have you have the academic year opened with your presentation. Over to you, Sanne.
Thank you so much. I feel truly honored, and I think this is an absolutely fantastic way how to also discuss, well, research that is, okay, by and large finalized, but still somewhat in progress because still needs to be defended, right? So today, what I will be doing, I hope within a couple of seconds, you will see my full screen. Now it should be seen as full screen.
We do.
Okay. So respecting the overall time frame given for this presentation, I will touch upon mostly on introducing you to my topic and my stance in general. I will indicate to you some of my conceptual and theoretical standpoints, and I will leave out certain thematic components such as differentiation studies and methodological considerations, and some of the very nitty-gritty parts of my results, the empirical results. But I'll go to the discussion and conclusions straight away. But of course, if there are any items you would like to ask about regarding these not exactly neglected, but excluded thematic sections, I'll be very happy to answer your questions during the Q&A session. So the title of my thesis that I am about to defend at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology, NTNU, is the EU Science Diplomacy towards the Southern Neighbourhood, reappraising the EU structural diplomacy. But yes, indeed, I have started already, well, for a couple of months, I have already done some postdoctoral research on science diplomacy in other empirical settings, and I'll be glad also to share some of those insights with you. So to introduce my overall research. My article-based thesis aims to offer a nuanced analysis and systematic insight into the role of EU-funded research cooperation in translating the overarching goals of the European Southern Neighbourhood, or ESN as an abbreviation, and the European Research Area, ERA. I'll be using this abbreviation. Into specific actions, tangible and sustainable results, increased mutual familiarity, and amicable relations. This thesis aims to add to the science diplomacy discussion, utilizing the European Neighbourhood Policy, or abbreviated as ENP, context. So the key 2015 ENP passage motivating the empirical focus of this thesis is the following. The EU should engage more on this public diplomacy agenda with governments and civil society, the business community, academia, and other citizens in partner countries, in particular youth, including through science diplomacy. So there, in that excerpt, science diplomacy is mentioned explicitly. It's not there implicitly, because I mostly study science diplomacy in its implicit forms, but in the policy guidance, it's explicit. More specifically, the focus is on the ESN, and this thesis identifies the complementarities that projects funded by other strands than the European Neighbourhood Instrument contribute to meeting the overarching goals of the European Union. This combination of two bodies of literature goes both ways. On the one hand, this thesis brings to the ENP thinking science diplomacy considerations. Science diplomacy explains the role of research in foreign policy and diplomatic settings. In such a manner, it goes beyond the earlier bird's eye view analysis, such as, for example, Oguru's published in 2013. The study is restricted to the post-Arab Spring period throughout 2014 up until 2017. The chosen time frame period affords me the opportunity to study more routine rather than emergency mode collaborative research routines and collegial socialization practices. While much of ESN literature displays skepticism or critique of the EU engagement with the southern flank of the neighborhood, this thesis strives to bring more balance into the scholarly discussion. The ERA serves as a unified space for research, innovation, and technology interactions to enhance the EU's internationally excelling science performance and economic and industrial competitiveness. The findings of this thesis are grounded in projects funded by EU framework programs, EU FPs in the abbreviation. These findings encourage arguing for the great potential of the ERA to further the EU structural power beyond its borders and offer tailored, pragmatic, sustainable, and location-specific solutions to various challenges encountered by the ESN. On the other hand, offering to the science diplomacy scholarship more insights founded on the ESN and its literature avoids too much intergovernmentalist and Westphalian thinking on the EU external action. State centrism prevails in the majority of science diplomacy literature. The ESN context stresses the diversity of the EU counterparts in the neighborhood and international setting. The ESN dynamics inform more thoroughly about the EU impact on tackling challenges beyond its borders through multi-stakeholder partnerships and joined-up efforts of an international community of experts from diverse country, institutional, and intellectual backgrounds. Contextualized more broadly, the objective is to analyze the understudied empirical material of EU-funded projects to widen the overall scholarly understanding of how the EU is shaping its relations with one geographic fragment of the bow-shaped area ranging from Russia, Ukraine, and the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. focus on Morocco and Tunisia, two front-running southern countries, ensures a good level of nuance and details specific to evidence-informed policy making, as well as the research and science policy domains. Both countries share a long track record of close, advanced, and enduring ties with the EU, structured across a wide range of policy areas. Many of the jointly agreed and implemented measures tackle the interdependencies between Europe and the ESN. The CSN country choice ensures that the overarching patterns studied through close examination of various empirical materials serve as a microcosm of some of the broader dynamics affecting the whole policy area for 10 states. The research question guiding the thesis is: how does research cooperation help to achieve the overarching goals of the EU Southern Neighbourhood Policy and the European research area? This inquiry addresses the research gap that the existing literature on the EU external action and engagement in the neighbourhood lacks a comprehensive approach. The vastness and versatility of the EU instruments and their use to engage with NAP remains seldom studied. For example, El Anoui, Shahidi, and Zawi in their publication published in 2022 and Garibi in 2023 name a list of the higher education and research instruments and programming tools, but they do not study them in greater detail. This might be one of the reasons why so many efforts and accomplishments of the EU remain outside of the academic and research scope. There appears to be a propensity of minutiae inquiry into geopolitics-driven high-level political statements and interactions between officials, but it results in a narrow and highly pessimistic portrayal of the EU engagement with the ESM. To answer the research question, the initial point of departure were the following four hypotheses. First, the EU FPs aimed at funding cutting-edge science do not encourage very elitist, only the best of the best engagement of Morocco and Tunisia-based entities. A notable diversity of Europe-based coordinators incorporated in the project consortiums, various Moroccan and Tunisian institutions. Second, the Europe-based coordinator of an framework programs-funded project welcomed a Moroccan and/or Tunisian institution to the consortium because the coordinating institution wants to improve its centrality in the European research area. Third, the participation of Morocco and Tunisia-based institutions in the framework programs-funded projects are not based on recommendation expressed in the open calls for project applications to include in consortium entities from the ESM. The participation of Morocco and Tunisia-based institutions in the framework programs-funded projects is based on a recommendation expressed in the open calls for project applications to include in the consortium entities from the African Mediterranean countries. So the first two hypotheses were grounded in a selection of research output on the European Neighbourhood Policy, the European Southern Neighbourhood Policy, and EU actorness, actorhood, and actorship, the EU External Action and Science Diplomacy published well, roughly until 2019, choosing the 2019 publishing year as a general guiding criteria for the academic and grey literature review during the early stages of the preparation of this research, the whole research project, slightly deviates from the choice of the empirical material. Namely, this thesis analyzes various empirical material linked to the EU FP's funded projects that were implemented during at least one of the following years, 2014, 2015, 2016, and 2017. And most importantly, my prior professional experience with EU-funded project implementation and ad hoc engagement with some EU-funded project consortiums informed the development of core elements at the initial development stages of this thesis. And I should stress that I have been very fortunate to obtain that, so to practice theory, say, embody itself at the Secretariat of the Council of the Baltic Sea States with two fantastic project consortiums. I believe that it matters a lot where a person obtains some formative experiences, and I'm truly grateful for having experienced that exposure to the grandness and boldness of European governance in close partnership with so many truly talented and very dedicated colleagues. And I hope that at a certain stages in the future, I will have an opportunity to work at least with some of them on new exciting initiatives to build something novaturient. And I say this with no nostalgia nostalgia, I say this with a commitment to even greater plans for the future. Coming back to my thesis, my professional experience solidified my certainty about some blank areas in the existing body of literature that deserve to be addressed in greater detail to ensure that the EU neighbourhood relations are examined in a more balanced manner, tapping into understudied policy areas and under research expert interactions allows for refining the academic and policy making understanding and providing a more holistic view of the processes and EU-supported dynamics shaping its neighborhood. The obtained empirical insights were also essential to advance the author's, well, my contribution to the practice theory, as ambitious as it might sound. I chose to focus on practices as a means to extend the time horizons of structural power constellations and foster eranetization. Eranetization is a newly coined term defined and explained in this thesis. Eranetization refers to the supranational steering results of the European research area, supranational guidance incentives, entities from across the world interested in co-developing research-intensive solutions to societal challenges to seek partnerships and consortium affiliations through the ERA governance architecture. And additionally, the thesis articulates in greater depth the contemporary ERA field dynamics that rely on the agent's capital acquisition, transaction pursuits, and aspirations towards centrality and high interconnectedness with peers. Okay, tapping into literature review on European Neighbourhood Policy, the historical roots of the European project have benefited from a considerable scholarly attention. Furthermore, the consecutive application of the project logic, domain-specific endeavours, such as the format of collaboration funded by EU FPs, are well-established EU tradition. The adoption of project approach dates back to the pivotal role of Jean Monnet, one of much debated and analysed founding fathers of the EU. While the NEP has received growing scholarly attention in recent years, some under-researched aspects remain. In particular, less attention has been paid to the agents of transfer, such as project managers, who are crucial experts in the EU external engagement. This thesis is guided by the need to acquire a more comprehensive picture of the agents and diverse dynamics that characterize the external engagement of EU-supported or funded entities, among other representatives of the Union. They are also referred to as an inherently pluralistic choir, EU's international choir, and a variable and multidimensional presence. Such a multidimensional engagement sometimes results in a cacophony of messages. This is not surprising because the EU is often seen as a hothouse for the participation of different types of actors, using the words of Costa. This engagement's motivation, rationale, and incentive structures differ for all agents involved. So the attention paid to the daily implementers of EU-funded activities corresponds to a slightly adjusted version of the scholarly recognition concerning the international organizations that telling narratives to individuals chosen for the implementation of EU prioritized activities is as important as listening to them. Listening is essential to fully understand the unique identity of the EU and what inspires, entrusts, and confuses its affiliated entities. Diverse forms of actorness, actorship, and actorhood that shape EU relations with its neighboring areas and are involved in the EU legitimation strategies should receive more attention to fully grasp the versatility of the EU policies, programming tools, and instruments in the pursuit of maintaining the closest political ties, compatibility of legislative frameworks, and as high the economic integration as possible. The ENP was designed as a system of foreign policy, economic, and security instruments, extending standards of good governance, the rule of law, and respect for human rights to the neighboring countries. This vast thematic scope of policy engagement provides an extensive repository of instruments and institutions tasked with overseeing and executing public and science diplomacies for an empirical study. This plenitude of examinable material sources offers room for researcher to explore various theoretical, conceptual, and empirical avenues. Pospisil, in his publication in 2018, encouraged pursuing the EU foreign policy as a concerted but at the same time technocratic rather than political endeavor. Following this line of thought, projects capture the daily routines of domain-specific cooperation between peers located in Europe and the neighborhood. Interactions among these colleagues remain understudied. Research projects are promising grounds for not just joining the overall scholarly choir united by a collectively upheld, a rather harsh critique of the EU. This group critiques the EU for falling short of the minimal capacity to transform its neighborhood. Furthermore, the EU is criticized for being trapped in a spirit of navel-gazing. Traditionally, the incoherency between national positions is invoked in the internal blame game. Xianqiara notes that the EU has discursively shifted to downgrading its initial expectations. The Arab Spring is called a disaster for the EU foreign policy, and the EU response criticized for being slow, fuzzy, and controversial. Sevesi criticizes the EU for its policies towards the southern neighborhood, hardly able to go beyond constituting an identity construction exercise. Dupont and Passy were skeptical that the EU has not yet seized the formidable opportunities for regional influence opened by the Arab Spring and not reconsidered its flawed priorities in the region. The Mediterranean was described as plagued by the revolutionary bandwagon or waves of protests stemming from the chronic economic instability. And recent literature on differentiated integration sums up some of the key issues in the following manner. It's published and authored by Löwen, Riedberger, and Schilafening. 2022 publication. Conflicts in Libya and Syria fueled by civil war in the wake of the so-called Arab Spring exposed the EU's internal divisions and lack of common strategy. As the conflicts in Libya and Syria escalated, and with them humanitarian crisis and migratory movements, the EU was unprepared and not more than a bystander, eclipsed by the actions and inactions of great and middle powers. Instead of adding more fuel to this bonfire of laments, this thesis adopts a more pragmatic and down-to-earth approach. A closer look at the EU projects moves away from the generalizations that Brussels lacks a complete inventory of instruments to translate its ambitions into action. This thesis explores in greater detail an understudied area of empirical material where the much sought-after co-ownership is built among consortium members. There are some versatile tools at the disposition of the EU to address the persistent ring of fire and sustain the recommended ties to support positive transformation. Furthermore, the salience of this thesis and the choice to look more attentively at the research collaboration is founded on the following earlier observation. The ENP is characterized by a multi-layered combination of bilateralism, multilateralism, and region building. Nevertheless, there are challenges to integrate the Mediterranean region due to divergent dynamics across its subregions. Expert-level dynamics in the research domain often conducted in close cooperation with a broad set of public, private, and non-governmental entities reveal valuable platforms of EU legitimization. These collaborative routines are much more versatile and consultative encounters with civil society practiced by many other international organizations. Project-driven expert cooperation demonstrates exciting patterns of supranational steering effects. These steering reverberations are concerted through the programming and implementation measures of the European Research Area, among other international outreach opportunity structures. So the chosen focus of the interactions between experts builds on the findings that the extent to which the EU is able to integrate its external environment into common policy systems of rule, in fact, differs according to the modes of governance. for example, hierarchy, network, or market, in particular policy fields. Thus, it is impossible to generalize to other EU policy domains the findings about the role that research and academic ties promoted via project-based and network governance type activities have in the EU's diplomatic toolbox. However, a better understanding of one domain helps to improve the overall understanding of the comprehensive processes evolving in the EU's southern adjacent areas. Additionally, these findings are instrumental for the aspirations to achieve better strategic planning of the EU foreign policy, and the insights obtained about the past track record in project implementation from the foreign policy and diplomatic perspective should help to develop more thoroughly informed choices for future programming and planning of actions. In focusing on the entities involved in EU-funded projects, the thesis casts novel light on how the historically progressive internationalization of community internal policies and their strengthened research-intensive institutions, in other words, citadels, already deliver some of the EU goals in the form of implicit science diplomacy. And building upon Dresheva, thinking on representants, project coordinators are considered embodiments of constitutive effects of supranational policy frameworks. In the EU context that is studied in this thesis, they play a key role in naturalizing international actors. In contrast to the main existing body of scholarship, this study departs from the widespread embassy window. This thesis is not preoccupied with the coherence between national positions, commonalities, and the in the university background of diplomats, the right balance of sympathy or bias in ambassadorial stances. This study does not focus on the potential of increased influence over joint decisions and actions offered by the EU institutional constellation. Furthermore, this thesis does not place in the limelight the EU delegations and the European External Action Service more broadly. The prevailing focus in the existing literature is on the traditional diplomatic corps. Additionally, noting the importance of earlier studies of the European Commission, this thesis looks beyond the myriad of EU institutional entities and focuses on the beneficiaries of EU research funds. This thesis explores the dynamics of collaborative routine that shape the extended ties of European integration and the EU actorness in the neighborhood, while not neglecting the importance of classic diplomatic routines and the role of tradition and long-established orders. This study invites to pay equal attention to the contemporary orders, rules, and processes of evolving explicit and implicit processes or dynamics with relevance to the supranational diplomatic aspirations. The EU policy frameworks such as the ERA and the NAP are examples of such evolving supranational orders with distinct rules, procedures, and dynamically evolving routines. The expert-level dynamics in the research sector and their role in fostering ties between the EU and its neighborhood take center stage in this thesis. Thus, this thesis reaches beyond the established scholarly inquiry patterns into the EU advisory circles or administrative networks. Certain ERA patterns remain understudied, especially the value this policy framework delivers to the neighborhood context. The daily routines of influential agents such as project managers that form the strategic pathways and intersections in international research, science, and innovation cooperation must be examined in greater detail. It is not a choice guided by the interest to appraise scholarly expert circles. Instead, it is an interest in obtaining a balanced and more thorough picture of the strengths and weaknesses of the scientific domain, the effects and implications of its incentive structures on knowledge generation and other societal processes. This study pays attention to the fruitful and dysfunctional expert network dynamics acknowledged in the scholarly publications. All these are highly relevant processes for the successes and shortfalls of the NAP and its southern dimension. To better understand the recent track record of the EU implicit science diplomacy in the neighborhood context, this thesis turns towards what Weiss refers to the third EU, namely a wider pool of actors forming the EU intellectual ecosystem of outside insiders deserves more scholarly attention. Furthermore, the choice to tap into expertise of project managers is a response to the need mentioned above for future theory building, which is necessary to incorporate perspectives from neglected actors and processes. This thesis elaborates in more nuances the role of EU-funded project managers as legitimation agents who operate as strategic norm entrepreneurs or transnational moral entrepreneurs. Promote norms because they believe in the ideals and values embodied in the norms. The thesis builds on the EU internal capacity to raise awareness, assemble expertise, and pool forces to tackle strategically important sustainability issues. This accomplishment inspires exploring the external, or more precisely, the neighborhood dimension of a project to deliver results to benefit the EU strategic frameworks. Last but not least, the focus aligns with a much earlier published observation of the European external action constituting different types of policy making and a very productive new arena for testing out the techniques and analytical methods. This thesis maps a promising area for generating new empirical findings on implicit science diplomacy practices as an integral component of a broader set of EU policy strands, here the NAP and the ERA, with foreign policy implications. Science diplomacy develops next to other framework perspectives, for example, the Earth system governance and its project. This project seeks the Earth System Governance Project seeks the best modalities and future pathways for societally relevant and sustainable research-intense solutions across a broad spectrum of domains. Science diplomacy is both practice and scholarship that unpacks that practice, and where both inextricably intertwine, but without agreeing what is and what isn't part of the study. The chosen focus on supranationally supported expert dynamics proves its worth in the context of country-focused studies and transnational and cross-border cooperation. Furthermore, it is worth paying attention to recent observations that many foreign ministries view science narrowly, looking for economic and technological advantage or simply cultural promotion. Thus, studying science diplomacy focusing on two EU policy frameworks, the ENP and the ERA, widens considerations that are brought into the science diplomacy analysis and evidence-informed policy. Moreover, this study of contemporary exchanges relevant to the European diplomatic realm is a complementary building block of the overall rich diplomatic history of interactions across the Mediterranean adjacent areas. This thesis brings to the existing literature more insights aligned with the contemporary EU public diplomacy rationale to let the EU support beneficiaries speak about EU's value and results the Union has assisted in achieving. This thesis agrees with the criticized one-sided view of diplomacy as the art of peaceful negotiation and its overwhelming pacific aura. These aspirations have led to the so-called renaissance, attested by new science diplomacy themed public gatherings, publication series, and awards. And science diplomacy is positioned as a noble practice that serves the larger good. The nobility of the cause benefits from the public perception of science as a universalistic and non-partisan domain. Some of the most well-known writers of the subject have described science diplomacy as a holistic process involving informed decision-making to balance national interests and common interests for the benefit of all on Earth across generations. Quoting Bergman. Science diplomacy is linked with calls for recognizing and addressing imbalances in scientific cooperation between the advanced European economies and several parts of the world where capacity building is much sought after. Such emblematic and widely referenced examples as the Synchrotron Light for experimental science and application in the Middle East, in abbreviation SESAME, are embodiments of the noble pursuit. SESAME involves countries that look for advanced research cooperation opportunities for the benefit of the peaceful development of the region. The noble aspirations guiding Sesame are strengthened by the inspiration taken from the foundation of the European Organization for Nuclear Research, or CERN. Nevertheless, the altruistic dimension of science diplomacy are interlinked with innate competitive qualities, often linked to the instrumentalization of science to feed rivalry between countries or groupings of countries. The real-world complexity and power dynamics involved controvert the benign, affirmative picture of science diplomacy presented by science diplomats or science diplomacy advocates. This is among the challenges that stand in the way of scholars interested in coining a coherent definition of EU science diplomacy. Science diplomacy does not escape the traditional geopolitical dynamics connected to research inquiring into interlinks between political ambitions and international research activities. And taking as an example some considerably recent research publications, incorporating notions of diplomacy as an integral component of war would overstretch this study. It would come to the detriment of striving towards a focused analysis. Thus, this might be counted as one of the limitations of this thesis. It does not capture the most comprehensive view of science diplomacy. And this demarcation of science diplomacy in this thesis is further supported by the aversion to going down a more complicated path briefly outlined by Villain and Strömblom in their publication 2022. They point towards the lack of clarity on what peace as opposed to lack of it really means in contemporary setting. This ambiguity is tied to the engagement of civilian and military capabilities in the pursuit of peace internationally and the future modus operandi of the EU Mutual Defense Clause. These concentrations have increased weight in the ESN context because of the ongoing increased arming across the area and geopolitical tensions attracting interest among international security analysts. Since this puzzle is not the overall task of this thesis, the matter is not examined in further detail, apart from acknowledging this interlinkage with science diplomacy in the existing literature. Additionally, this thesis does not incorporate more established forms of classical diplomacy that evolve next to the other heterogeneously defined terms familiar to diplomacy studies, such as public, cultural, academic, and educational diplomacies. Taking into consideration its characterization as a transboundary field, science diplomacy is among the conducive pathways to study how non-traditional entities engage in diplomacy alongside states with their respective expertise, values, and other assets. The overall inquiry into science diplomacy has sparked a rediscovery of the broader college and boundary questions shaping the practice of diplomacy. Such a more expansive view allows looking beyond the existing recognition of the complexity of the science policy interface on various governance levels. Thereby, science diplomacy carves out a new perspective on the multifaceted role that research insights play in shaping policy dimensions, stances, and actions in various parts of the world, such as the Arctic, the Antarctic, the Himalayas, Central, Eastern, and Southern Europe. Broadening the contextual background even further, the potential of science diplomacy is brought to specific thematic domains such as sustainable cruise tourism and contemporary remarks on international scientific exchanges during the Cold War. With a reference to the usefulness of history, or passé utilisable, cases concerning the past of science are brought into science diplomacy learning occasions to frame the past as learning sources in relation to the contemporary and future challenges. Considering the scholarly recognition of universities' role in shaping public discourse and policy, the ESN context brings more diversity of insights to this international zest to explore various meanings and the importance of science diplomacy. And this focus on the ESN coincides with the scholarly observation that Arab countries have shown an increasing interest in the diplomatic dimension of science, technology, and innovation, especially when addressing the most pressing challenges faced by this group of states. Science diplomacy has a role next to other information sharing and collaborative encounters, such as Mediterranean's naval presence and growing saliency among the EU intelligence services. Out of various taxonomies, varieties, and typologies developed by researchers, this study is guided by two of the three most established ones. Diplomacy for science corresponds to tailored diplomatic efforts to facilitate research cooperation in the international domain. The chosen research constellation interprets diplomacy for science as those domain-specific strands of structural diplomacy that facilitate research cooperation to reach more overarching foreign policy goals. Structural diplomacy refers to interactions and negotiations with non-EU countries and other regions of the world in a twofold pursuit. First and foremost, these encounters follow the classic diplomatic logic to establish and maintain conducive relations. Secondly, the ultimate accomplishment and characteristic that distinguished structural diplomacy from the classical one is to achieve sustainable effects and implementation of these engagements, which would last longer than the period of the interactions. It is noteworthy that even scholars who do not use the term structural diplomacy and do not refer to either Susan Strange or contemporary authors who build on her thinking refer to structures. They elaborate on the core reasoning of structural diplomacy. Hurd in 2015 is an elucidatory example. And quoting, diplomacy is a social practice. It is a form of interaction among social actors that is framed by the existing social structures of rules, norms, and habits, and that is in turn productive of these structures. These rules define and constrain the practice of diplomacy, and they are in turn reproduced and changed in the course of being deployed or invoked. Structural diplomacy is brought into, end of quote. Structural diplomacy is brought into the picture as a clear perspective on the way EU remains relevant and retains its value as a continuously fresh vision among the elites long after the post-war period. Since science does not have a pronounced or very detailed role attributed in the reviewed key EU framework documents, the research demands deeper analytical excavation and elaboration about the implicit and important role that the EU-funded research collaboration play in the overall EU structural diplomacy setup. And this is a point of intersection between diplomacy for science and the analytical concept of differentiated integration in this thesis. Open calls for project applications are chosen in this thesis as telling sources, not only to pinpoint key factors that have facilitated the integration of such countries as Morocco and Tunisia into the ERA. These documents unveil the steering practices from a science diplomacy standpoint. And this output indicates how research policy is programmed to foster ties among specific geographical entities to address particular challenges. It is implicit science diplomacy because the studied open calls for project applications to the EU framework programs are not traditional diplomatic documents. The documents of the open calls for project proposals adhere to the EU research policy. However, access to project funding has been curated towards other non-EU countries, such as restrictions placed on Israel, Switzerland, and Russia. And present-day clear-cut evidence of It presents a clear-cut evidence of how influential research policy instruments in the overall structural diplomacy and external action pursuits of the EU are. Science for diplomacy refers to the use of science as an enabler for amicable and good relations in the international realm. It is reported as the prevailing understanding of science diplomacy among some circles of scientists. This taxonomy of science diplomacy sets conducive grounds for analyzing project consortiums as multi-stakeholder groupings with a broad representation of scientific communities understood as entities that produce and apply knowledge. This thesis is one of the examples and responds to earlier calls for theory to become multi-perspectival. With reliance on Bourdieu-inspired practice theory, recent currents propelled by the EU-funded and supported science diplomacy initiatives are brought into the ENP literature. And building upon these considerations, this thesis brings a more supranational perspective to the value of science diplomacy. It does so by restricting the scope to two strategic policy frameworks, the ERA and the ESN, and to argue for the wealth of added value brought by the EU facilitation of encounters between international groupings of research-oriented experts, including representatives from Morocco and Tunisia-based institutions, masterfully. Much of the existing science diplomacy literature and scholarship with considerable thematic affinity to science diplomacy focuses on classic state-to-state encounters. And this thesis brings more post-Westphalian considerations to how science diplomacy is skillfully employed for the benefit of supranational concentrations and joint-up approach among an international group of interested entities to serve interests and goals that go well beyond the diplomatic efforts of their respective countries. So, concerning practice theory, despite its heterogeneity, practice theory reconfirms itself as an outstandingly promising framework with international resonance. This thesis builds on the latest primarily, but not exclusively, Bourdieu-inspired scholarly interpretations of habitus, field, and capital to study the relational dynamics of the era and the avenues through which it incorporates the ESN countries. It benefits from Bourdieu-inspired remarks on the historical background of 20th century science diplomacy elaborated by Jana in 2022. Furthermore, the choice of practice theory benefits from its saliency among scholars researching diplomacy. Through practices, the agent can either reify the status quo or shape an evolution of social practices. For example, the agent can pursue discursive alteration of specific meanings and corresponding actions. This thesis entails a study of agents' motivations in navigating the ERA framework field and its habitus in pursuing capital acquisition transactions and centrality aspirations in relevant peer circles. Consequently, it is a scholarly quest to identify the contemporary notions of authority, competency and correctness, and routines aimed at the validation of knowledge claims as those are established within a specific field. The contemporary concentrations of impactful and outstanding diplomatic practice are closely intertwined with the mastery of modern technologies. These are helpful academic findings for a study of implicit science diplomacy practice not restricted solely to in-person encounters. Effective use of technology in the pursuit of an influential standing and compliance with unwritten rules tied to various technological affordances is also relevant in the ENP and ERA setting, irrespective of the associated risks of confidentiality breach, ever-evolving new generations of tools for communication analysis in the pursuit of foreign policy requires constant learning to master the contemporary diplomatic craft. And taking an inspiration from the studies on the circulation of knowledge, the ERA framework field corresponds to an inclusive arena of knowledge that is characterized by some forms of knowledge circulation and spans beyond top-performing universities and academic establishments. The ERA should strive for some level of autonomy. However, such a relative independence should continuously benefit from flow security, meaning smooth interlinks with the various parts of the world to benefit from excellent ideas and valued applied research solutions among other intellectual assets. Such interlinks and pathways are not purely ideational. This realm of intellectual links on certain occasions can involve a strong dimension of materiality. Quiroga Vilamarin, in the publications published in 2020-21, studies the way social-technical imaginaries are tied to the materiality of the judicial framework. And taking inspiration from his line of thinking, an institutionally defined and law-making endorsed field may foster interactive intellectual dynamics with the support of specifically designed physical sites or objects. Thus, projects tied to specific buildings, installations, or other types of geographically situated elements serve as the most informative items concerning the way ERA and the EU, using the ERA as the framework field, steer international ordering through its supported and maintained permanent and temporary institutions for regional governance. In such a manner, this thesis offers an introductory connecting point between practice theory and new materialisms in their diversity, going beyond the traditional focus on the reviewed new materialists on international law. And this thesis invites to turn the new materialist gaze towards the EU supranational governance structures anchored in the EU acquis communautaire. The EU legal framework sets the basic conditions for the study of framework fields and their subfields. It defines some of the core logics according to which agents attune their capital and transaction routines that I have shown in a graphical way on the slide. The permanence of the chosen study angle for this thesis lies in its potential to explain the routines which put the EU structural power in motion through implicit science diplomacy encounters. This thesis goes beyond the short remarks made by Bertelsen in 2022 on this aspect. This thesis explains the role of practical or phronetic knowledge, in other words, an expertise that is founded on a nuanced understanding of errands governing specific milieus. However, this knowledge of milieus is more nuanced than ad hoc references made in the American setting concerning, for example, informal lunches, children's leisure activities, and facilitating encounters among government and senior administration officials. The structures enabled by the unwritten rules of habitus, the fluidity of subfields, and the simultaneous permanence of the framework field, the promoted or sought after forms of capital, enact and sustain the EU structural power, thus going beyond the analytical scope of Loignini and Zimmerman, published in 2021. This thesis engages in greater nuance with the diffuse aspects of power and routines enabling the power projection. Practice theory is essential to explain how certain geopolitical entities, such as the EU, promote the permanence of its created and favored order. Practice theory allows understanding of how the prevalence of the EU favored present and the EU intellectual footprint is ensured through daily actions of agents, in this specific case, leading researchers and research administrators. The salience of structural power perspective stems from the documented perceptions among the American think tanks of the EU as an economic power whose strongest point is the attractiveness of what it offers in terms of its neighborhood partners in deep and comprehensive cooperation structures. The multi-layered and multidimensional nature of EU instruments designed for its neighbors is a strong asset of the EU. It allows for a more solid power projection than the ephemeral intellectual variations revolving around the European dream and the longing for the contemporary European Renaissance. The literature refers to patterns of self-enforcing behavior, as Blue in his publication 2019 simply and clearly puts, practices make time. Moreover, practice theory provides a thorough insight into how agents field dynamics, habitus-guided actions, and logics of capital transactions create the present practice and generate the future. Some scholars recommend developing a more interconnected approach towards the past, present, and future in the next phase of the development of social sciences and humanities. And following this suggestion, competent practices enables solidifying EU structural power projection in the future. Even more importantly, competent practices give rise to the future. The masterful immersion of agents into the habitus and the knowledgeable engagement of agents in various capital transactions sustain the present shape of the field. Moreover, competent practices increase the potentiality of the field to remain intact and continue evolving in the future. Thus, practice theory helps to understand a time in the making, or time production. The sustenance of the field facilitates the described construction of time. And practice theory enables a better grasp of the future potentiality and prevalence of a specific favored governance constellation. The uninterrupted reification of practices is essential. Any potential or actual interruption of the practices decreases the overall potentiality of the upheld structures. It is a matter of safeguarding the permanence of the future. Moreover, the continuity of practices secures the potentiality of a reiteration of practices in their existing or evolving forms. Thus, it is not about simply maintaining the status quo and remaining conservative in reifying practices. The practice may evolve in the form and execution, but must remain fully aligned with the overarching goals guiding the structural power projection. This future-making exploration relies on a thorough and multidimensional understanding of the nuances of collaborative encounters that took place in the relatively recent past, especially those estimated by agents to be fruitful for sustaining interactions beyond the project timeframe. The agents' prolonged routines rely on the reification and evolution of the field, its habitus, and capital transaction practices. The agents play an essential role in sustaining the projection of a specific order captured by the structural power and its intensity, in line with the capital accumulation propensity and pursuits of increased centrality characteristic to some of the interpretations of Bourdieu. This thesis sets forth the notion of Eranetization. As I mentioned earlier, Eranetization is a term, and it builds on Brusselization, as it has been articulated in the existing literature. Brusselization refers to a deepening of member states' reliance on cooperation within the EU. Furthermore, Brusselization refers to the propensity to seek joint solutions in routine meetings held at the EU institutions of Brussels. Consequently, Eranetization refers to the potential and the ability of the ERA to foster a similarly increased orientation of science, research, and innovation for policymakers, researchers, and research administrators to use the EU-offered institutional formats. Furthermore, Eranetization relies on the EU-designed implementation architecture. This architecture allows engaged agents to channel their interests, seek internationally upheld joint initiatives, and implement specific actions. Eranetization not only extends the EU structural power across a broader spectrum of entities than those in the EU member states. Most importantly, Eranetization refers to fostering and incentivizing an intentional drive among potential and actual beneficiaries of the EU funding for science, research, and innovation to, so to say, go ERA. Consequently, the capital transaction and accumulation pursuits encapsulated in going ERA work to the benefit of the EU. This propensity to, so to say, go ERA translates into increased access to the EU to research and expertise delivered internationally. Ideally, Eranetization relying on Bourdieusian field dynamics habitus accessible internationally and capital transactions weaved with worldwide counterparts should work to solidify the EU posture as one of the internationally leading centers of scientific and geopolitical gravity. To stress the interactivity of the field dynamics, the considerably Bourdieu-inspired literature on the circulation of knowledge or circulation studies was helpful. This literature added more depth when elaborating on the pursuit of agents within the consortium, domain-specific field, and ERA framework field characterized by diverse power dynamics. Through its zest, yes.
Yeah, good, thank you.
Yeah, through its zest to revisit iconic authors, the history of knowledge experienced a small internal reinvention. This resuscitation is to the benefit of analytical depth of this thesis. This thesis focuses on the ESN with a robust capacity building component offered by the ERA. Thus, the role of a reception has been a helpful element in studying the dynamics of collegial networks and the accomplishments of agents acting in their capacity as intermediaries, curators of knowledge, knowledge brokers, or influencers. Reception refers to the intellectual act performed by a researcher of taking up theories, methods, or concepts from European hubs of expertise and using those in his or her own work, potentially transforming the obtained knowledge for local or institutional purposes. The latest writing on Eurocentric or periphery dynamics confirms reception dynamics directed from Europe-based social sciences hubs towards the neighborhood. And these are encouraging findings for arguing about the accomplishing the knowledge circulation instilled in the era. The ERA framework displays a capacity to put in motion a well-curated, appropriately tailored channeling of differentiated integration incentives steered by the European Commission. The theoretical and conceptual parts of the thesis are and its articles clarify major influences from Bartiosan international relations scholars. However, the comprehensiveness, the academic authors contributing to other academic disciplines and thematic domains were also incorporated. It was done to carve out the details of the chosen conceptual modalities. In many respects, this thesis sits at the intersection between international relations and public policy, characteristic to many thematic strands of European studies. First and foremost, this thesis displays receptiveness to the latest thinking on general matters of scholarly interest to the present and future of international relations. In such a manner, this thesis captures responsiveness towards new twists and turns in a non-combative way against the established knowledge. As references depict, the primary influences emanate from Europe, categorized as the semi-periphery of international relations. And to specify, in the Eurocentric manner and European studies, the EU is positioned as the ultimate core and centrality towards other peripheries. In contrast, all of Europe except the United Kingdom is categorized as semi-periphery in global international relations. This thesis is anchored in European studies and argues about the prevailing centrality of Europe, with interest in one of its neighborhood areas as one of Europe's margins. However, theory-wise, the author, well, that's me, does not disregard the global context of how Europe is positioned in disciplinary terms. These considerations are factored into weighting the relevance of one scholar's contribution to the theoretical and conceptual body of literature, especially its significance and positioning in this thesis. A perspective entails selectivity. The positionality of a researcher shapes the crafted analysis. And practice theory rightfully highlights that the theoretical and empirical considerations, including reflections on the relevance of various elements, evolve simultaneously. These stages of research are not ordered chronologically, one after another. Feedback loops between the research stages described in the thesis methodological section and also the corresponding articles clarify the thesis particularities. And there is widespread and diverse scholarly interest in the development unfolding around various international rankings of research and higher education institutions, individual researchers, or research groups. This interest in rankings as performance metrics and markers of status inspires situating research projects in the capital acquisition context. Rankings are selected as one considerably researched example of how diverse field dynamics and markers of recognition, prestige, and centrality in the field unfold and shape the research landscape, including the positioning of various agents in it. Various internationalization dynamics affect European academia and add an additional layer of considerations linked to the overall multifaceted understanding of centrality in various subfields. However, it is only one among many dimensions of the overall task, inflation, and so to say workload creep associated with a research career, as well as expected teaching staff qualities and service delivery in the research and higher education sectors. The latest research findings attest to the exposure of European researchers to these extended roles and responsibilities. For academia and the quality of being entreprenemic are among the terms indicating the continuous scholarly inquiry into multiple roles taken up by academics or discussed as valuable pathways to obtain unique expertise. Academia is tied to the same worries of undervalued professional capital and increased workload as expressed by other domains of scholarly inquiry into the research and higher education sectors. And these elements and notions concerning individual positionality form an agent's overall instrumentality for one's operation and capital transactions in the field and subfields. These activities might span well beyond the planned outputs of studied EU-funded projects. When reviewing the existing literature, the net was cast widely. By adopting an inclusive approach, I could better understand the comprehensive background against which to situate the findings drawn based on EU programming and funding stream. And due to the time limits of this presentation, I have chosen to exclude an elaboration on differentiated integration. It merits a separate presentation. However, please feel free to ask about this dimension of my doctoral thesis during the Q&A session. So then moving forward and to the concluding part. First discussion. This thematic section is dedicated to some new research threads that I encountered during the thesis article's finalization stages. It brings some further contextual remarks on how the findings captured in the thesis articles might be brought forward beyond the time frame of this thesis to increase the certainty or contest the generalization of the research findings. Furthermore, the subsequent subsections expand on the depth of the qualitative dimension crafted in the ESN context. In such a manner, this overview demonstrates openness and receptivity to various latest currents of thematically relevant academic thought. Likewise, the core topics of the discussion structure in the subsequent topics highlights some additional context in which the research findings are found salient. First and foremost, I would like to mention diverse means to foster centrality in the ERA field. What is noteworthy and distinct about the practices studied in this thesis is that they primarily, but not exclusively, revolve around a specific type of research pace referred to as project time. This work mode, research and diverse interactive practices, including a pronounced social media engagement component, are not governed by self-paced rhythm and flow. Instead, it is a workflow mode governed by predefined and binding deadlines, timeframes, and deliverables. And the thesis findings correspond to the heightened pressure and increased infrastructure that positions professors as chasers of research funding. Conclusions drawn based on EU-funded projects might be less applicable to the characteristics and particularities of other dimensions of academic work and professional incentives inbuilt into other policy domains and industries. Conclusions drawn about project time practice may not be generalizable to less rigorously curated research encounters. For example, the intellectual interaction and study pace in academic journal publishing or journalology is governed by slightly different rules, routines, and mechanisms than project management. Academic journals have not only disseminated information, but also created research communities and perpetuated scholarly norms that govern how research is conducted. And the personal experience of the thesis author, well, that's me, in navigating journal dynamics and peer reviews attests to this uniqueness of this academic domain. As some of the semi-structured interviews attested, publishing in journals is oftentimes part of the required research activities of EU-funded projects. Publishing has its own worth in the academic pursuit of centrality in a network. And this thesis does not present a clear demarcation between these two routine practices of consortium members. Instead, both are closely intertwined, and journal publishing is valued as one of the components contributing to the added value and sustainability of project results, carrying extended resonance beyond the accurate and diligent delivery of planned project outputs. Second point on the EU structural diplomacy in the ESN geopolitical context. Overall, following some of the classic studies on social and knowledge ties, a project is a time-bound intellectual space. In this project intellectual space, NAP entities are more peripheral to the overall ERA constellation, thus confirming the earlier findings on social and knowledge ties. NAP entities are incentivized to demonstrate their competence and distinct value they bring to the consortium. And this thesis does not entirely neglect that a Eurocentric view encompasses a constellation of core and periphery that both ESN countries might not necessarily identify with. For example, Morocco views sub-Saharan Africa as its southern periphery and dedicates diverse outreach activities to it. Royal visits should be singled out as the most high-level diplomatic encounters with an economic rationale. Considering this self-positioning in the foreign policy context, it should be distinguished that the Morocco-led research outreach dimension of EU-funded projects does not have solely a European-related science diplomacy dimension. On the contrary, in this thesis, the theorization of Europe-based project managers as the key EU structural power projection facilitators stresses that the characteristic of being located in Europe is essential embodied competence of ERA practices and routines. Such a geographical positioning facilitates the projection of EU structural power. No matter how experienced the ESN-based entities are in the ERA habitus mastery, their institutional and individual embodied selves are deeply affected by the geopolitical concentrations of their location, which is not theorized in this thesis as having the quality of EU structural power projection. ESN-based entities may pursue science diplomacy derived from European facilitated and EU-funded institutions. But that is not the EU science diplomacy. No matter how well informed one is about the EU and Europe, an ESN-based individual speaking and acting in a professional capacity during an EU-funded project occasion is not theorized in this thesis as embodying the fully fledged EU spirit and European mindset. It is a well-integrated individual. This individual has benefited from the positive external differentiated integration incentives throughout his or her access to ERA via project consortium. An ESN-based individual remains a well-informed proponent of EU-funded activities, and nevertheless, this individual is not theorized as embodying the full ERA habitus and supreme capital transaction mastery. Consequently, he or she is not eligible to be characterized as embodying, representing, or being sufficiently fit to project the EU structural power. And further study of this dimension of ERA routines would help to understand more details about how EU considerations and ESN local geopolitical and diplomatic aspirations intertwine, collide, or complement each other through specific collaborative and outreach-oriented research engagements. Moreover, the concentrations revolving around the Arab-Islamic inflection point related to foreign policy, and diplomacy across the Middle East and North Africa through such approaches as regime-boosting regionalism are kept outside this overall Eurocentric thesis. However, the potential of these factors and the role of extended geopolitical alliances tying in the ESN dynamics, several extra-regional powers are not neglected. These factors can have an impact on ESN science diplomacy developments. The reference is made to the science diplomacy discussions of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation expressed during an anonymized roundtable with consortium members from Europe and several countries in the Middle East and North Africa region of one project attests to the importance of this concise elaboration on the international context that is kept outside of the thematic scope of this thesis. The role of Islamic thought in fostering international ties and financial support measures across borders deserves to be addressed in a separate research project with a focus on science and innovation cooperation. Contemporary Islamic thought deserves more attention despite the domestic variations in institutional viewing of religious aspects across these states. Moreover, the alliances these countries forge with other global heavyweights and assertive powers to solidify their international leverage are acknowledged in this thesis to be equally important in a pursuit of comprehensively look at the ESN dynamics. This interconnectedness and interdependence bring a whole myriad of factors into play, and it is too complex to be addressed within the framework of this specific thesis. So, concluding my presentation, the ERA, and most importantly, one of its funding arms, the EU framework programs, encapsulate the immense potential of the EU science diplomacy to project the EU structural power across the ESN and address specific societal challenges faced by this geographic area in a tailored and research-intense manner. The EU-funded projects as temporary institutions serve as time-making ecosystems because they reify the EU's supranationally steered collaborative practices. Projects do not only make time, most importantly, outstanding and highly performant projects embody competent practices that generate a future aligned with the overarching goals of the EU external action. Impactful projects are influential EU structural power projectors. And having such a resonance of resilience-building achievement and being discussed by project implementers in the context of other geopolitical heavyweights of the Middle East and North Africa region means that the EU science diplomacy cannot escape the geopolitical context and inquiry into its ambition in this domain. However, the EU geopolitical capacity through science diplomacy-enabled structural power should not be conflated with the traditional understanding of geopolitical might. The EU sui generis character and the ERA habitus in which it invites and weaves in other entities from across the globe through various capital transactions is unique. The insights drawn from a study focusing on the ESN encourage to conclude that the Iranization offers exceptional promise in addressing peace and security challenges by placing science in a pivotal position to assemble experts from across the world to solve diverse challenges through research-intense solutions. Iranization furthers the EU structural power and European integrationist dynamics inbuilt into supranational governance constellation of the EU. And most importantly, Iranization promotes the EU internationally as a resilience-enhancing project with international resonance and relevance. Contrary to earlier critical analysis of the EU engagement in various peace promotion episodes, the ability to withstand various challenges in Europe through financial support of scientific encounters across a vast spectrum of beneficiaries has positive resonance across the neighborhood. The EU resilience building and peace promotion initiatives are considerably widely accessible in both studied countries, Morocco and Tunisia, and internationally. Science furthers mutual understanding through nuanced interactions and advanced reasoning to tackle specific issues. By funding beneficiaries worldwide, the EU framework programs bring nations closer together, promoting research achievements and enhancing mutual understanding. Projects as temporary institutions promote the sense of a common cause and joint ownership of responses to shared challenges. Continuous expert-level interactions and mutual understanding are the core of global peace and security. Science furthers sustainable peace and security in the short and long term, and the integrationist dynamics of the European research area serve not only the professional goals of scientists keen to gain international recognition and engagement opportunities with peers. So to say, going ERA is a choice towards submitting individual career pursuits to an overarching policy framework that promotes peaceful and prosperous development in Europe and beyond. The ERA is a habitus grounded in the grandest peace project. And the ERA facilitated structural power projection shapes individual research career aspirations into a path serving broader societal challenges and seeking effective responses to tackle those. The comprehensive thematic coverage of the EU framework programs is an impactful constellation of financial programming to support these needs and align those with several domain-specific or themed EU policies. The differentiated integration lens attests that the participation of Morocco and Tunisia in projects funded by EU FPs is incentivized through the prioritization of consortium members from specific geographic areas. This conclusion attests that the ERA is supranationally steered away from one-size-fits-all approach. Instead, positive external differentiated integration and segmentation across subfields of ERA framework field is supranationally orchestrated in a tailored manner. And this thesis paves the way for further exploration of potential answers to the question, are the ongoing supranationally steered dynamics leaning towards the Union and its partner countries becoming ever more united in differentiation or differentiated in diversity? As this thesis clarifies, this question goes beyond the national choices of the EU member states. Increasingly, it concerns how the EU supranational institutions, such as the European Commission, prioritize relations and policy responses in a densely interconnected and intertwined neighborhood, reiterating the role of explored element of the overall multi-level administration setup. The findings show that some geographical regions gain supranational attention with specific guidance from the European Commission on how to segment and with whom to segment. And the study of Horizon Europe and subsequent framework programs, as well as more extensive inquiry into various European Southern Neighbourhood country profiles concerning engagement in the European research area, might offer more thorough insights into the implicit EU science diplomacy practices, the generosity of the EU open access databases, and responsiveness of project managers witnessed during the preparation of this thesis attest to the promising field for further inquiry into the EU structural diplomacy potential in its neighborhood. And the European neighborhood country profiles remain studied in a somewhat limited way. There remains more to be discovered about the external action value of the EU framework programs funded projects involving European neighborhood policy-based beneficiaries. Thank you so much for your attention. Here I have highlighted with dark blue those publications that are part of my thesis. However, I also wanted to take an opportunity to overcrowd a slide with some of my most recent publications. But in case you want to consult the full list of my publications, I have also added the ORCID and Google Scholar. Those are open access. Thank you so much. I conclude the presentation.
Thank you very much, Zane, for this super rich introduction into the universe of your conceptual reflections and the theoretical backdrop of your thesis and of your work so far. I'm fully aware, Marina, of your time horizon because Marina has to leave for another meeting. Is there any immediate reaction or anything you wanted to underline so that we can still bring you in?
Yeah, I mean, yes, thank you, Zane. My apologies, but I have another meeting at 3 o'clock. So, I mean, it was really, wow, very comprehensive. I think, it was also for your good exercise, right? For your PhD defense, I suppose. My only question, but maybe, the others can pick in, and I'm not sure I can even, answer, I can even hear your full answer, but it's about your key argument as, coordinators as legitimizing agents and all these, Brusselsization, Erization, and so on. My question is, how do you think, I don't know if you said this during the presentation, and apologies if I missed it, but how these coordinators really balance, their role as legitimizing agents while ensuring that, Moroccan and Tunisian partners have equal influence in shaping the research agenda rather than, simply adopting European norms and priorities. So, I mean, is there an agency as well? Because, so far it looks like, this, as you say, Brusselsization, but what about the two-way process that maybe, Gabi will also say? That was, my just first insight, and really sorry if I have to leave a bit early.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much. And Diane, I see you also have to leave. Any remarks from your side so that we can integrate them into the discussion?
Thank you. It's been quite a marathon. There's a lot there, and there are many, many different terms that I would have ordinarily picked up on, like transnational moral entrepreneur and things like that. Also, European mindset. What's that? How do we know it exists? And what are the ways in which it's exhibited? And does it get created through science diplomacy or other forms of diplomacy? But I'll just pick on one thing, because it was the one thing that interested me and I'm not familiar with, and that's even a word I have difficulty pronouncing, Iranization or Eraization. Yes, that's interesting to me, and I will go away and look it up. But my question related to that is that propelling Eraization outside the EU does not go into a void. Okay, it goes into political cultures and regimes that possibly very welcoming and do not resist, but nevertheless tinker with, okay, or adjust or modify or adapt in some way. So that's one aspect. But when I say that Eraization does not go into a void, there are also other regimes in play. And here I'm thinking of the Americans and their notions of science diplomacy, or the South Koreans, or the other big actors that are projecting values and norms around diplomacy, whether it's science diplomacy or some other kind of diplomacy. And then in particular, I would say one of the big contests to Eraization, about which I know very little, so I'm stepping a little out of my comfort zone when I say this, there is the Chinese, okay, and the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, which has a very which has a public diplomacy aspect to it in this around research, innovation, the cooperation of universities along BRI, which has been discussed in a completely different framework as knowledge diplomacy. So I'd be interested to see about your ideas in relation to your approach and that of knowledge diplomacy, which I have to say I do not like as a framework at all, but I'm interested to see how you respond.
Thanks a lot. Shall we collect? Zane, Mira has a question.
Of course, yeah.
Yeah, and then cool.
Sure, thank you. I definitely second some of the questions that Diane just raised, and what Marina mentioned earlier about how do we understand some of the greater complexities of these roles of these project managers and coordinators. Connected to that, and again, apologies if you did mention this and I missed it, I know you were not talking much about the methodologies, but the conclusions that you gave in the chapter on, I'm trying to scroll up and find where I jotted them down, but on the role of the ERA as an enabler of resilience building in the ESN, putting into motion new relations, dynamics, as a positive influence. What was the data basis for those conclusions? And anecdotally, I know that there are many cases in which that's not the case. And in a lot of projects, the nuance is missing and that level of empowerment is not necessarily as strong. So what was that landscape like in terms of the evidence for that?
Yeah, great. And I also have, Moritz, did you? Okay, Moritz just excused himself. So I also have, I know that your focus was on the conceptual landscape, the embedment and the link towards the theoretical framework. But actually, what also came up for me as very interesting points to discuss is obviously scale and timing, is the scale of the research, collaboration, sustainable enough, combined with the timing of research project to lead to anything that could resemble a sustainable approach in this science diplomacy dimension. And then a question to what also Mira touched upon, the empirics and the methodology. It would be really interesting to understand also your definition of project manager. Is that ERA personnel? Is that the project coordinators? Is why exactly you focus especially on this sort of personnel embedded in the coordination of projects that might be a little less visible in terms of the research cooperation? That would be very interesting. And the question of methodology of case studies that and that came up in your conclusions, that highlight obviously also the geopolitical dimension. Diane, you mentioned that with the Chinese approach, that is a bit different, and that is overlayering. I mean, it's not that it's falling on blank, on free space. There's a lot of competition, if you so wish, for these type of cooperation going on as a geopolitical instrument for different actors, US aid, Chinese government, and these more practical research methodology and research design questions would be interesting too. Thank you.
Sorry,
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks for being here. Thanks.
Yes, I'll start with Marina's question. I'll go chronologically. So regarding the co-creation of or legitimate, like the actions of legitimizing actors. Here I go back to the great value, the essence of EU-funded projects, that most of them entail a very strong co-creation component. So those are advanced research collaborations that are addressing specific challenges. So there, she made a very good point about, is it simply adaptation of European norms or something more? And I would definitely say that there is something more and more complex going on because European experts in these projects are oftentimes involved to co-create tailored solutions for specific either geographic areas or specific systemic issues. For example, linked to ecosystems or let's say Mediterranean basin sustainability matters. And then it's not simply some sort of technical transfer of European know-how or norms. It is a very interactive co-creation and collaborative collegial engagement. So those are not simply European experts coming in, let's say a quick flight over the Mediterranean for 2 days, showing off their presentations with their findings crafted in Europe. No, there is much more of that interactive pattern. There are field works together. There is enduring and very complex work on establishing certain research infrastructures in the Northern Africa that demand, well, much more than a project. But that's where I also encountered these great collegial ties that span beyond 3 years and even more, beyond 10 years. So oftentimes a certain EU-funded project is a qualitatively, let's say, a high peak of collegial cooperation. It's been prepared and it's been discussed to be implemented for years. So that actual encounter is well prepared years in advance. So that's where I would say that it's a co-creation. It's not simply, let's say, a technical transfer of some expertise from the European side. Diane Stone's question about eranetization. I chose a longer version, so not simply
Eranization.
I don't know how she mentioned something shorter, but I took eranetization based on the existing policy instrument ERANET. So it's ERANET. It's an abbreviation for an existing EU instrument. And then I added simply ization, because I felt like, okay, that's easier to pronounce. It's long enough, but Brusselization is also quite long. But it's short enough, and maybe it's more memorable just because there is already a policy instrument in place for more than some years. It's ERANETS, so ERA networks. Then, yes, it's quite a new term. So my first article on it, or touching upon it, was published in 2023. So there is some information already out there in open access regarding my initial thinking. But now I'm currently developing more contours around it as I go along with my postdoctoral research on other contexts, for example, Egypt and Algeria, and seeing some new patterns, empirical threads that might further enhance my understanding. Okay, so how how does that propensity to use those opportunities offered by European research area work, in maybe more diverse contexts? So what is the most appealing? Is it just the network? Is it access to certain infrastructures? Is it access to a very specific training? Or some other things? There are multiple dimensions, but looking at, which specific ones are more defining for certain contexts or certain scientific disciplines is where I might find further, let's say, thickening of this idea and this notion of Eranetization.
Yeah. Did you find, sorry if I jump in there, did you find this competitive element in your research where Diane said, okay, but EU is just one actor who's active in the regions with different approaches? Was there something like, okay, but we have a menu to pick and choose, EU is one actor, there are others in the regions or in the two countries, or not?
Well, I mostly interviewed project managers, so Europe-based. So of course, it's a perspectival, look at these things. But I had also an opportunity to briefly discuss one project with a consortium member group. So there was this mentioning of the Islamic organization, and that's where my thinking went. Okay, that was a very good empirical insight for me, that it's not just certain European analysts or internationally acclaimed academics who say that indeed there is this multi-layered character that you rightly mentioned. But these are people who are involved in the actual projects that I studied who say, yes, well, for example, we are not only working in EU-funded projects, that there was an appreciation for EU projects, but in parallel, these experts are engaged in other formats, for example, those that are prevalent for the regional cooperation in the Middle East and North Africa. And that's how I discovered more, beyond the textbooks, this multi-layered dynamic present.
Yeah. Is that research, sorry, just for the understanding, is that research project managers in the universities of the PIs, or is that ERA, so the research agency project managers?
It's PIs, it's principal investigators.
Yes.
This ties into what was asked. So what is the project manager? So I selected initially from Cordis, the community research database, the open access one, in a systemic way, the projects. And then I looked at the lead entity and their contact person, and I strived to get into contact with project managers. On certain occasions, but very seldom, I could not reach the project managers. They are rather busy people, especially taking into consideration many of them have notable seniority levels at their institutions, perhaps even very big institutions such as, major universities in Europe. So it's not so easy. So then I had an opportunity, for example, to have some discussions with other the same project implementers who are not the PI, but are part of that specific institution that is the lead institution for that specific project. So there I also gather these very interesting things that I have studied in the Project Archetypes article published by the Latin American Journal for European Studies, that also, that seniority and that prior experience with EU projects and academia and research sector at large also factors in the way people contextualize. My interviewees contextualize their engagement in a project. So I'd say not only the collegial ties or the sustainability of collegial ties that I mentioned earlier, that maybe span across a decade and more, but also there are other institutional and other, let's say, societal engagement experiences, maybe prior even to the project or during the project, influence the way they contextualize information that they offer about the project implementation and its science diplomacy value. Okay, good, understood. Yeah, and I think there was, so regarding the databases, as I mentioned, first and foremost, my go-to starting gateway was Cordis open access database. It's a fantastic information tool. I cannot stop appraising it for its nuanced information and for the interesting research designs that it offers to develop. Yes, I started there from simply systematically looking at the projects that were implemented starting from 2014 up till 2017. My first research was very poor. So when I looked only projects within those 4 years, it was a handful of projects. Very little empirical material would get out of it. So I enlarged it. And as I mentioned earlier, so I took all projects that were implemented in at least one of those years. So starting from 2014 up until 2017. And what a myriad of insights I got, because there were some projects that were already concluded in 2014 and 15. And unfortunately, for some of them, you know, the turnover of people in various institutions, large, especially maybe large bureaucracies, people just, they maybe don't leave the institution, but they move on with other portfolios. So I had a bit of a challenge to reach out to some of the older or not so recently implemented projects. And then due to the COVID, there were also extensions of projects that were starting to implement in 2017. So actually during the phase when I was interviewing projects, I had this absolutely fantastic coverage of both very, you know, like long time concluded projects that are somewhat, you know, like as archives. They are as a reference points, a bit of a passive reference point, right? Because everything has been concluded like 3 or 4 years ago, and you know, it's done. Yeah. So it's an accomplishment and it's done. And then I had these projects which are living laboratories. They are still on. Everything's ongoing. Finalization is ongoing because due to the pandemic, for example, some of them got extensions because force majeure could not afford them the opportunity to go for field research, for example. Yeah? So, and that was the interesting dynamic. So both concluded processes that are somewhat archival and the ongoing, very, you know, like in dynamic processes.
Can I hop in there actually just as a follow-up question? Thank you, because that was really, you know, interesting to hear those two spaces. You mentioned interviews just now, and also when you were answering Gabby about how you're defining the project managers and coordinators. Just out of curiosity, how many interviews were they, and how many of those project managers, or how many of your interviewees were EU project managers, PIs, coordinators in that bubble, and how many were from ESN partner institutions, just to understand where those discourses were coming from in those conclusions?
Thank you so much. So the properly completed and documented interviews, the semi-structured one with Europe-based project managers, those were 19. Then the 20th, unfortunately, I couldn't complete all the checks, so I couldn't fully incorporate that one. But I was very lucky with one of the ongoing projects to actually have this small focus group. So I'd say, yeah, I got like an extended insight from one of the projects. And then, I complemented that with additional, as I said, this differentiated studies insight. So that came when I was going, let's say, backwards. So I took as a reference point, my Cortis systemic research results. So what were the projects? I looked at the most represented specific programs across the pool of my projects. And then I looked at the open calls on which basis these projects were selected for implementation. And then I looked at what were the exact contents. And that's where you get the insight that I was elaborating very shortly during my concluding remarks regarding differentiated studies. I did document like the content analysis, narrative analysis also of those documents. And I was looking, okay, so on what were the preconditions? What were the thematic criteria on which grounds these specific countries were prioritized? And for some of those calls, and, you know, especially those that were the most resonant ones in terms of on whose basis the most of my study projects were accepted for implementation, were referring to Northern African countries. So for a smaller proportion of projects, it was important that those were European neighborhood or European Southern Neighbourhood countries. But the European Southern Neighbourhood context or reference point was not the prevailing one. For most, let's say, environmentally and sustainability driven projects, it was Northern African partner country. So that exact geographic location on whose grounds the value that these specific beneficiaries bring was the precondition to include them in that specific project to increase its competitiveness, to gain the funding and then the implementation phase.
Great. And did you, during the interviews with the PIs, you also talked about the project application process, right? Their ideas of whom to integrate, why the selection, the reflection on selection. Was that part of the empirical analysis in the interviews, or?
No, not exactly. I would say that some of them elaborated on those considerations, especially when I was asking, for example, regarding prior collegial ties. So whether the project was actually the first time that they met and collaborated on a research collaboration basis, right?
Yeah.
But it was not a purposeful part of the semi-structured interview template. So when I initially designed the semi-structured interview template, that dimension of differentiated studies wasn't there yet. I actually added it because there was a research opportunity, a fantastic doctoral school hosted by the University of Oslo on differentiated integration. And then it enlarged on the differentiation studies at large. That gave to me some great ideas. Okay, how to go about and look at that European Commission steering function. And that's where I came about. Okay, so on what preconditions actually these beneficiaries were selected? Because what you oftentimes get when you look at these bottom-up dynamics, for example, when researchers talk about their colleagues, there might be more of that, bottom-up agency elaborated. And that's naturally so. That's not incorrect, right? I was the one who invited them. I had great encounters prior with these colleagues, and I really wanted them, to be part of this project to increase its overall success. And that's that, individual agency or institutional agency. For example, my colleagues said they did fantastic work and we're working now on this continuous pattern, I'm taking over from my colleague, let's say, good experienced project partners for a next collaboration. But in that narrative, well, perhaps it's, partly reasoned by the formulation of my questions. In that narrative, there might be that absence of, okay, what other considerations have come to the fore? And that's where this document analysis of the open calls document package was so helpful to combine both bottom-up and top-down incentives.
What is the time frame of now the university procedure with the PhD? Is that still this year, or the evaluation?
I haven't right now received the exact guidance. We'll see. With academic. Thank you.
Going into recording again. Thank you very much, Sana. That was really an interesting universe of a lot of overlapping elements of your conceptual universe that you designed for the thesis, which is it's a huge volume of also theoretical reflections that you brought in. I'm really curious to dive more into, and thank you for the list at the end of the presentation. Do you want to send us the presentation, or do you want to keep, or at least the list, so that we can distribute the list?
Oh, sure. I'm so sorry. I didn't send it yesterday, but I sent it today. So please feel free to share my PowerPoint slides also with the other.
Great, because I think the list of your publications will be very interesting for many to read.
Yeah, it includes also some additional slides. So I wasn't sure about the academic background and prior expertise of people that might attend the event. So that's why I added, just to make sure that I have some background information to offer. So if you would like to receive the presentation slides, the ones that I actually presented today, so without the additional ones, I can also send that cut form.
As you feel, as you prefer. Yeah, great.
Okay, great.
Super. Thank you so much. Next time, 14th of November, conspiracy theory. Nicolas Guyot. I hope to see you again there.
Okay, great.
And thank you very much for your presentations. It was really interesting. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, and see you.